is Dexter Wansel, and as a child, from the age of 8 years old, my mother met and married Clinton Woods, who was the brother of Georgie Woods, who was a popular disc jockey here in Philadelphia at 2 radio stations, WDAS and WHAT. And that very first week, Clinton took me to the Uptown, where he was the counter at the front door. He would count people going in the, to watch the shows. And then he took me backstage to meet his brother and, me and my mother and my brother. And we met Georgie and became family. And I became an errand boy literally from that point on backstage at the Uptown Theater. I worked for all of the shows and musicians that came there. There were literally 3 shows every day for 10 days. Most of the shows ran 10 days. And so I got to meet a lot of people. And the band leader, one of the band leaders there at the time, it wasn't Bill Mass, it was Doc Bagby was there for a while. And he showed me my first chords on the organ. There at the Uptown, and I got to meet a lot of great musicians. I got to work the very first Motown review, with all the Motown acts early on, and I got to work the King Records tour, which of course had Ivory Joe Hunter and James Brown and the Famous Flames, and so many other artists that King Records had at the time. And it was wonderful because the Uptown really gave a place for artists to work, black artists to work, because a lot of places they couldn't work, because of segregation in America at that time. And so that's how I began as a musician and learning about music. Well, I think it means a lot. I think it's supposed to mean a lot. Of course, in those days, it was, there was some segregation here in that immigrants from the South moved into North and South Philadelphia because they could afford those properties, and where they couldn't move into other areas because of taxation and the property values were too high. If you're only making 50 cents an hour, well, you can't live where people who own businesses or who have inherited homes and stuff like that, you can't live there. So it made its effort to bring people together here, and the fact that the people that owned the Uptown allowed for black artists to have a place to perform shows that, yes, there is definitely an aspect of brotherly love here. Well, I was born near here in a place called Bryn Mawr, which was a part of the main line where all the industrial families lived, all the corporate owners lived. Philly was very famous for its main line back there. My mother cleaned houses on the main line, but my father was a drummer that she met, and initially, and so she began to follow him and to various areas of the country as he played. She was actually my mother is actually from Lewis, Delaware. And I did spend time down there on the farm of my grandparents and my great-grandparents, partially living on a farm down in Delaware, raising food and vegetables. And I became very interested in the night sky out there, and I never forget the first time I saw a meteor shower was in Delaware, and there's no lights there, so at night the sky is extremely clear. And that musically, that experience made me want to know more about outer space and what was going on in the solar system, and I ultimately began to write songs about that later on, as my career got started. I've lived in numerous places in Philadelphia. I've lived in the Mount Airy section. I've lived in North Philadelphia. I've lived in the Olney section. I've lived in South Philadelphia, so I've had numerous homes. I moved from the Olney section to near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, about almost 5 years ago, and which is way out in the country with the Amish people now.
Philadelphia is also known like the city of neighborhoods.
Yeah, well, there are many neighborhoods in Philadelphia. I mean, there's the Northeast, which contains about 6 neighborhoods. There's South Philadelphia, there's Frankfurt, there's North Philadelphia. There's either side of Broad Street has very numerous neighborhoods. Germantown, which was a part of the Revolutionary War, Cheltenham. I could go on. The neighborhoods are immense in Philadelphia. Well, you're absolutely correct in that, because a lot of the musicians, of course, the string and horn players, of course, came from orchestras, you know, or big bands. But as big band music kind of fettered out, R&B picked up and took on the strings and the horns, you know what I'm saying? And so to have a place for them all to come together under one banner, and that is making music, was a wonderful thing. I got one of the early musician gigs I had first was as a keyboard player for live performances of MFSB when Bobby Martin was the conductor. And of course, Don Ronaldo asked me in 1976, when Bobby Martin left, to become the conductor of MFSB, which I did. I was their live conductor for a couple of years. And we went all over the country, and I got to know everyone. And even to this day, I still, like if I'm writing an arrangement for my son, I always call Emma Kumro, who was one of the original string players, to put some members together for me to write my arrangements with, or to have them play my arrangements. Of course, that means when real estate gets taxed in a way that people can't afford it. So if they decide to go into, say, a black neighborhood and raise the taxes, rezone, and redistrict, well, we can't afford the taxes being raised, so we have to move out. Redlining became gentrification, you know, all over the United States. It's not a good thing, because people who can't afford the tax hikes and another thing redlining did was that if you lived in an area that was rezoned and they decided to raise the value of the houses, you had to rehabilitate the house to a certain number in order to remain there. And of course, most people didn't have that kind of money. And this was back in the 70s, 80s, and the 90s. They did a lot of redlining here. South Philadelphia is a classic example. The bottom of North Philly is a classic example. That used to be called the bottom. It's now called Northern Liberties. And they did that in thousands and thousands. It's still happening. Of people of color had to move, you know, because they couldn't afford to stay there anymore. Well, social structuring is politically mandated and corporate mandated, you know, and Philadelphia is slowly becoming a university town also. So the universities are buying up a lot of the properties. If you own a property there and it gets rezoned to benefit a university, let's say Temple University, you've got to move. And what they will do is they will offer you, in a lot of cases, what they call the market value of a home. But who sets the market value? You know, in South Philly, what happened, just within the past 10 years, homes, you could sell your home at a market value of, say, like $40,000, and 3 or 4 years later, it gets sold for $300,000. Well, what happened is suburban, middle-class America was built upon, in my opinion, was built upon the advent of the Second World War. And what happened afterwards is that they created a GI Bill which tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the United States were able to take advantage of by getting loans for homes, getting good health care, getting loans for small businesses. But of course, separation was still the rule. You know, civil rights was not enforced, and so people of color, or GIs of color, could not do the same thing. I believe that the middle class in America was built on what happened from 1945 through 1965. It took 20 years for us to say, hey, we want a share of that. We want civil rights too. We want to be able to vote. We want to be able to own homes so that we can create inheritance. I mean, inheritance is a big thing. That's when you pass down your house or your business to your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. For people of color, that was very difficult to do because we had to make money in ways that we had to figure out, because getting a job, you know, in a separate but equal society was difficult. The changes I thought were very good in come the 70s, because even though there was still a lot of hard realities to face as far as prejudice and discrimination, in the city, there were good things to see too, and that was, like you were talking about, MFSB, how we all were able to come together and play with each other, learn about each other, and take pride in each other and respect each other, you know, on a level playing field. If anything, I think that shows what can happen if people come together. Great music, great ideas, great principles can be created. Well, having lived in North Philly, you know, I lived on Bouvier Street for many years, for at least 6 years, and I got to see a lot of the changes during that period leading up until 1963 and 1964. The changes were beginning as early as then, especially in the bottom area of North Philly, even though they were building projects for people to live in, and a lot of those projects are gone now. But immigration from the South is what really populated most urban areas of this country as far as people of color. Because after slavery, of course, a lot of slaves, former slaves, or descendants of African slaves did not want to stay in the South. So they tried to move out, but wound up staying anyway in a lot of areas of the South. And because they couldn't get out, or they were still being harnessed with segregation and Jim Crow laws, and the blues became our sort of rebellious move, you know, to sing about what was happening to us. And the blues, of course, really helped to create other forms like rhythm and blues and rock and roll. That comes out of the blues, you know. So, but of course, you know, a lot of musicians moved up from the South here into Philadelphia, as well as Chicago and New York and other areas, Detroit, you know. And jazz, blues and jazz was here in Philly, you know, back in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and even in the 60s. I mean, a lot of great jazz musicians, most people don't know, have roots in Philly, like the Heath brothers have roots in, they're from Philly. Lee Morgan, Pearl Bailey lived here and is buried here. John Coltrane worked out of Philly, you know, and so on and so forth, you know. So we have a great music legacy here, not just in R&B or in pop music, but also in blues and jazz. Well, of course, a lot of people love and respect Frank Rizzo. I think as a mayor of Philadelphia, I think that initially he kept certain not so good principles in place, but I think as time went along, he started to move away a little bit from those principles of discrimination and suppression, as a police chief, he was very hard on people of color, you know. He would actually have them stripped down in public, you know, to nothing. And I just felt that if you ran into the police back then, you believe it or not, I think that it was about the same as what's happening now, you know. But incarceration is much greater now than it was back then, you know. Mass incarceration now is like 50 times worse than it was back then, because most of us, even though we were fighting for civil rights, most of us went to school, most of us had jobs, but the reaction to civil rights, I think, in Philadelphia and in the national government was a very angry one. I think that there were things done to urban communities, including Philadelphia, to repress and control us as a people, so that we couldn't get the jobs, so that we couldn't get in office, so that we couldn't do a lot of things that the rest of Philadelphia could do. Even when I was working at the Uptown, most of the artists that came through the Uptown in the early 60s, they couldn't stay in the main hotels downtown. So they would stay in little joints in Philly, North Philly, and a little hotel that used to be the Bee something, I can't remember, the Bee Hut or something like that, that used to be a few blocks from the Uptown, that I used to walk them to, you know, at night after the shows and stuff. It's difficult to put into context what effect segregation had on America, because it's still felt by many of us to this day. It separated families. It caused us to seek other sources of income, you know. And when drugs and guns were really put into urban communities on purpose, you know, to keep us under control, to keep us in jail, to keep us, I know a lot of people aren't going to believe that, but there was a guy that worked, there was a guy that worked for Nixon that came out and told the truth. He said, we did that on purpose. You know, we couldn't fight against blacks or against the Vietnam War. And I'll remember his name, and I'll tell you his name. And he wrote, he did an article or did an interview for a magazine. And it'll come to me, and I'll tell you. And he said that we did it on purpose. And in that way, you know, we could create the laws and incriminate people who were strung out on heroin or selling heroin back in the 60s and the early 70s, you know. And unfortunately, they did a good job, because it still haunts us to today. And unfortunately, it's still their main reason for profiling. It's still their main reason for arrest, you know. It was like Giuliani, when he was mayor of New York, he created a policy called stop and frisk. And all the cops would stop and frisk people, 85, almost to 90% of which were people of color, you know, which was a way to arrest them and incarcerate them, get them in front of a judge. If you get arrested and you get in front of a judge, then the next thing is a plea bargain, you know, where the prosecutor will say to you, well, look, you may not have done anything, but the judge may find that you did, and you might get 2 or 3 years. But if you take this plea bargain, we'll give you 3 to 6 months, and you'll go home after that. But that's not the case. What happens is, yeah, you do the 3 to 6 months, but you also become a felon. And once you're a felon, then you're always under the scrutiny of the police. And once you're a felon, you can't vote. You see what I'm saying? Once you're a felon, you can't get a job. So from that aspect, suppression and discrimination is still a hard battle for us.
Have you read the books by Ta-Nehisi Coates?
Oh boy, he's something else. Yeah, he's
talking like,
well, he quantitizes the information properly. Yeah.
And he's asking for reparation, or
absolutely. I mean, the Japanese who were interned during the Second World War got reparations. The Jewish people got reparations here. you know, for what happened to them during the Second World War. But we haven't seen anything, you know. Our 40 acres and the mule are still out there. Yeah, what happened was right down the, right over here on Broad Street in North Philly along, I think it was Dolphin, or from Cecil B on up to Dolphin near the Uptown. People started rioting. And Georgie went out, talked to them, got on a loudspeaker, I think, and talked to them. I had moved, that year I had moved from North Philly into Tioga, but I heard all about it, and of course my stepfather told me all about it. And yeah, he asked them not to riot, not to set buildings on fire, not to set cars on fire, and to take it easy, because he was heavily in the civil rights movement. He was in Selma. He was with Dr. Martin Luther King many times on Dr. Martin Luther King's quest for equality. Equality is a strange word, because if you think about it, to get rid of segregation and discrimination and oppression would create equality, and a lot of people don't want that. You know, they don't want us to be equal in many cases. And so, yes, Georgie Woods was very helpful, and he actually got, he was the one that got, when Martin Luther King was in Washington, D.C., he put buses together for people to go to see that, you know. He was wonderful to me as an uncle, you know. Him and his wife, Gilda, were very receptive to me. Of course, I worked at the Uptown for four years, almost 5 years, as their errand boy back there, so I got to know him quite well. And actually, the last show he emceed was down at the Convention Center here in Philadelphia, and this was back in the late 90s, and I was the musical director for it. So back in the back, before we went on, he was telling stories about me at the at the Uptown, and how Herb Staten initially didn't know that I was the errand boy, and kept kicking me out every night, you know, from the backstage at the Uptown. What are you doing back here? Get out of here. You know, he'd take me, grab me by the collar, and walk me out of the Uptown. I was only 8 years old, and I would holler and scream, "No, no, Uncle George, come get me." But eventually, Georgie told him, "No, he's working here now. Let him stay," you know. Well, unfortunately, and it's still one of the oppressive policies, and I think, and that is freedom of speech, freedom of choice, and freedom of paths to unity and equality aren't really accepted. A lot of them are not really accepted. What I think movement was trying to do was trying to speak against the oppression and stood up against it, and of course they became a target because of that. And eventually, and what's sad about that was because at the time there was a black mayor here in Philadelphia named Wilson Goode, who didn't really oversee what happened, but didn't realize what could happen when it happened. And unfortunately, the police decide to go in there and into that neighborhood and arrest people, and the battle ensued, you know. And so, and I don't think anyone realized how many guns that move had in order to protect itself. But unfortunately, policies and laws state in this country that you can't protect yourself against policemen. And when you do that, it changes everything. Schubert Building? Well, you know, that's where I met Gamble and Huff, was at 250 South Broad Street, which was part of the Schubert Building. His office, their offices were there, and they had, it was a place, the offices, and The offices had interesting people that worked there, you know. The Schubert building, it was a good theater. I'm gonna stop there with the Schubert building. That TV studio, I think, was at 46 and Market, and it was Channel 6, I think. And there were a lot of, well, Dick Clark and Bandstand, that's where Bandstand was. And a lot of artists were able to get their records played or more, and were able to find stardom if they made it to that show. You know, if he brought you on that show, you were going to be a hit. And you know, one of his consultants was Georgie Woods. Georgie Woods would tell Dick Clark which records were really hot and people were loving out there, and then he would bring the artists on his show. And that's how that worked here in Philadelphia. What happened was, to me, doo-wop, you know, had a firm foothold here in Philly too. You know, there were a lot of great doo-wop groups here. Lee Andrews and the Hearts was one of them. The Vibrations. And so when doo-wop started kind of fading out and R&B and rock and roll kind of was fading in, a lot of those artists were looking for other places to go, or to, like the lead vocalist from numerous of those groups went out looking for, you know, jobs elsewhere, working for record labels around the country. For some things it was good, and for some things it was bad. Everyone knows about Cadillac Records. So to find a black-owned record company that maybe you could get into if you couldn't get into Motown. Motown was so busy, a lot of artists got turned away, you know. So by time the 71, 72 came with all those big hits that Gamble and Huff were having at Philly International Records on Billy Paul and the OJs and the 3 Degrees and MFSB, a lot of artists said, well, we're going to go there. It's a black record company, and we'll get treated better than we were at Cadillac or could be at Cadillac. I hate to say that, but you know what happened at Cadillac, right? So you got a Cadillac, I think, but it was hard to get royalties. You know, a lot of labels, it was hard for artists to get royalties. If you got signing contracts with record labels is an interesting story and a whole documentary in itself of how you could make money if you were the right artist at the right time, signing at the right moment. But most of the times, it was hard to get royalties. So where you made your money was through live performances as a performance artist, you know? I just think that it was the sound of the musicians, how the writers were writing a specific, well, first and foremost, Gamble and Huff, great writers, you know? They would come up with songs and ideals that no one else was thinking of, you know? It's sort of like, I'll give you a story of, who was the guy at Soul Train?
Don Cornelius.
Don Cornelius, right, came to Gamble and Huff and said, okay, I want you to write me a theme for a TV show. I'm doing a dance TV show. And so they wrote the song and they called it the Soul Train theme. But Don Cornelius said, nah, we're not going to call it the Soul Train theme. That's my show. So Gamble and Huff called it The Sound of Philadelphia, or TSOP. But the 3 Degrees are still singing Soul Train in the background, you know what I'm saying? For the show, when they used it on the show. And when I met Don Cornelius, he once told me, he said, man, I regretted that. That could have been called the Soul Train theme, and I turned it down. Or I wouldn't let it be called the Soul Train theme. And so they were great writers, and other writers wanted to be with them, like me. When I was actually living in China at the time when I saw a magazine with their picture in it, you know. And it was my home, you know. When I was an errand boy at the Uptown Theater, I got to see Kenny Gamble. He was also kind of working backstage in a couple of spots. Tom Bell was a keyboard player at the Uptown. You know? So I wanted to be with them, you know what I'm saying? The Uptown has deep roots in me, you know. So when I got out the service, of course, I went down and started auditioning songs. I would write songs in '71. I would audition for keyboard jobs at Sigma, and nobody hired me, you know. And then one day, one of the engineers at Sigma said, "Do you know anything about a synthesizer?" And I said, "Sure." And they had a Putney synthesizer, and I said, "Give me a few minutes." And I got a sine wave sound out of it and put it on a record. I was uncredited for a lot of records that I originally used a Putney before I got my ARP synthesizer. But anyway, getting back to well, I mean, when you heard the music, it was a different kind of feeling, you know what I'm saying? It was a different, like the Soul Train theme, Me and Mrs. Jones, I mean, Backstabbers, you know? I mean, that was like something else. That was something new, you know? So a lot of people, a lot of artists wanted to be a part of that. Well, Motown, how they started, Gamble and Huff kind of started the same way. They had separate labels. There wasn't a Motown, I mean, before there was a Motown, there was Tamla, Gordy Records. Before there was Philly International, there was Gamble Records and Huff and Puff, that Gamble and Huff's labels out of New York. So they kind of started the same way, but I think where they separated was that Motown, Barry Gordy was a writer, but Smokey was an amazing writer. You know, he wasn't just writing for the Miracles. He was writing for everybody else too. So, but with Gamble and Huff, they brought writers on board immediately. You know, people were writing immediately with them. You know, I'm not sure if that's such a big difference, but. So Gamble and Huff really had to come forward and come up with great hits. And they did even before Philly International, Expressway to Your Heart, you know. Dusty Springfield, Joe Simon, you know. And then, of course, they got Jerry Butler, and, you know. And one thing led to another. And anybody that would go in and audition for them, if they came up with something good, they would get hired. You know, where at Motown, Motown just settled, I think, basically settled on a certain group of people, and that was it for 30-some years, you know. It was a sense of equality. They were telling stories that we all share, that we all go through, that so many people in our lives go through, you know, broken marriages, trying to find love, secret affairs, Me and Mrs. Jones, you know. and so everyone in the world goes through that, you know what I'm saying? So, and that I think really helped. But then sonically and musically, when you had such great arrangers, I mean, their first great arranger to me, of course, is Bobby Martin, you know. But then there was Jack Faith, you know, who's a great arranger. Then there was Richie Rome, you know.
Alive, yes? Richie Rome, I think so.
MFSB had a lot of arrangers, and they worked for, like, MFSB was also South Soul Orchestra. MFSB was also the Ritchie family. MFSB was also John Davis and the Monster Orchestra. MFSB, do you see what I'm saying? That group of musicians was amazing, and that I was able to conduct them live, and of course I conducted all my own arrangements for my productions and other people's productions, and working with them was just amazing. And I think that that orchestra had a sound that people loved, especially in the early 70s through the mid 70s, especially then. Well, Well, he learned a lot, I think, in New York. He learned a lot business-wise. And I think he was able to bring that, and he had a pretty strong hand on how he dealt with situations and issues. And if he didn't like something, it wasn't going to get done. If he did, it got done. And that's how I would describe him. Mr. Leon Huff basically worked with Kenny in a way that Kenny was the business and administrator, and Leon just basically kept making sure that the music sounded right. They both did. You know, they both sat in on the mixing sessions of their productions and songs. They were very different in some ways, but in the studio, they were very much alike. Tom Bell really started out independently. He started out with Bell Records out of New York. He worked with Stan Watson and Philly Groove Records. He did the Delphonics. That was his big step forward. And then he did partner up with Gamble and Huff. Actually, the letters on the doors at 309 South Broad were GHB. That means Gamble, Huff, and Bell. And the publishing company that was created, Mighty 3, is Gamble, Huff, and Bell. But you're right, Tommy was very independent. He did his own thing also. He wrote arrangements and did some productions for Philly International, but primarily it was his own production company that he worked with, especially once he started working with the Spinners. I mean, that was amazing, that stuff that he did with them, and he's had hit records throughout the years on many different artists. And he was one of my mentors. What Tom did, well, Bobby Martin, when I first started writing arrangements and I would show him my horn and string chart, he would look at it and say, well, I'll focus on the horns. Let Tom look at your strings. And what most people don't know, what Kenny once told me, was on the song Backstabbers, it was Bobby Martin that wrote the horns, but it was Tom Bell that wrote the strings. So there are two arrangers on Backstabbers. And he was one of my mentors. I talked to him through the years. I was able to go out and meet with him in LA about one of his artists that he was working with at the time, James Ingram, and about working with James Ingram. And he wanted me to produce James Ingram and work with him, but it never came to fruition at the time. But wonderful, arguably the best ballad arranger in R&B history, I think. When you listen to the stylistics, You Are Everything, or Stop, Look, and Listen, You Make Me Feel Brand New, those ballads are unbelievable with the large string and horn arrangements that he did with them. I call it Gamble, Huff, Bell, and Tarzia. I really do, because I think that his production mixes, how he mixed a lot of those songs was amazing. I mean, you never heard mixes like that. The clarity of his mixes, I think, are better than most R&B records of the time. He understood the strings and horns, and he would place them in places on a record, stereo-wise, that you haven't heard before. You know, most records that you hear back then sound monolithic, you know, but his mixes engulfed you. You know what I'm saying? And he also helped develop the CD. Most people don't know that about Joe Tarzia. And Philly International Records depended on him day and night in his studios. And he also built a studio inside 309 South Broad that I worked out of for many years. I would go to the main building at 212 North 12th Street and work out of there, but mainly I would work out of 309, especially towards the final years. I was hired as a keyboard player for a group called Yellow Sunshine. And our album came out in 1973, and it's called Yellow Sunshine. And then at the same time, I also joined Instant Funk. And then by '74 and '75, I was the live keyboard player for MFSB's live performances, which we traveled all over the country, the White House, New York, and performed. And we actually, the rhythm section for MFSB, when Teddy left Hal Melvin and the Blue Notes, that same week, his first show as a live performer, we backed him. He had the show, but he didn't have musicians. So he was on the same show with us and asked if we would read his charts and play his show, and we did. I wrote songs on an album that I call Life on Mars, and it was because of my love of the outer space that I did that. And there are other songs on there that voice that, like Rings of Saturn and Theme from the Planets. I was really interested in synthesis and also arranging. And what I felt was, by 1974, 75, I felt that arranging and orchestrating had been done as good as it was going to be done by Tom Bell, by Richie Rome, by Bobby Martin, and so on and so forth, Jack Faith. And I wanted to try something different. So what I did was I took my synthesis, which actually got me into Sigma, programming their little Putney synthesizer back in '72 and '73 is what got me into Sigma. And then I met Al Pearlman, and he got me a 2600 vinyl, 2600V synthesizer, which I started using. And so I mixed synthesis with my orchestrations and arrangements, which gave me a different sound. And especially with my stuff, I really experimented with the albums I did for Philly International. I experimented with a lot of the artists also sometimes, you know, but not like I did with Voyager or Theme from the Planets, you know, or the other albums I did for Philly International. Well, things were changing musically all over the country, you know. In the beginning, there weren't many synthesists out there. In '73, I think I was the only one here on the East Coast working with synthesizers. And then there was Walter Carlos and Dick Hyman and a few others. And Herbie had a guy he was working with, and Stevie had a guy he was working with. But by '74, you could hear it on the records, you know, and then by '75 and '76, you really heard it, you know. And then the funk took synthesis over for the bass and the drums and, well, basically the bass sounds and a lot of the keyboard sounds, you know. Bernie Worrell, you know, with the Funkadelics, he really brought out synthesis in the funk big time. You know, so all the other funk bands started using it too, you know. So yeah, so that's what I did, and because I couldn't really compete that way. It had already been done as well as it was going to be done, as far as Philly sound orchestrations and arrangements to songs written by Gamble and Huff or others, you know. So I started trying a blend of synthesis and orchestra. Well, what it was that the core, the bass, drums, and guitar, Baker Harrison Young left to form their own record label, a Golden Fleece, I think it was called, and they were the nucleus, you know. So after that, we had to bring in other drummers, other bass players, Sugar Bear, Zob, Quentin Joseph, who came out of Curtis Mayfield's band, started working closely with Leon, and he would play on a lot of sessions. The drummer I'm thinking of, and I can't think of his name right now, actually took over from Earl Young and played the drums for years. It'll come to me a little later. Keyboard players changed because they became so popular. that they would form their own production companies and started working for other labels and as producers, you know, and started writing their own hits. A great example of that would be Eli Tartarsky, better known as Bobby Eli. He wrote Sideshow along with Vinnie Barrett for Blue Magic, you know, and other hits, you know. So everybody started branching out, and musicians that came in really took up the reins and did a good job. They really did. They took that sound and kept it going. They really did. And I can't remember the drummer's name. Don't edit that out. Huh?
Not Dennis Harris?
No, he was a guitar player. Well, that was, Gamble was really calling the shots of album covers back then for MFSB, or for everybody, literally. He was we would call the shots, we're gonna name the album this, we're gonna get Ed Lee from CBS to make it look like that. That was some of my first full productions, and I arranged Philadelphia Freedom, and I think I did a couple of songs on there as a producer, writer, arranger. And I think also that's why Don asked me later on to conduct them, you know. I think it had to do with Philadelphia. I think it had to do with the explosion of music that had happened out of Philadelphia, and that was, Philadelphia was now an international entity, you know. It had shot up into space. Things were changing. People weren't using, other record labels and producers weren't using the strings and horns as heavy, but that was Gamble and Huff's sound. You know, for them to do records without strings and horns was almost null and void, you know. So I think that was one of the reasons why at that time he asked me to become the A+R director, because we could see that the sales were going down. We could see that we were losing touch with what was going on out there, and so he asked me to be the A+R director, which I did. I tried to sign various artists. I tried to help move certain productions in a different direction, you know, away from, I'm not saying away from strings and horns, because I always use strings and horns, but not all the time. My thing was, okay, let's not do this all the time. Let's do other things, you know, and that's what I was trying to do with the writers and producers and as the A+R director. And I think it worked. I think I was able to help in that, during those years from 77 to 81 especially. Yeah, I think our Phyllis Hyman albums were really good. I got a chance to work with her. I used to perform with her. We did shows together. When I started, I had to go out and promote my albums, even though I was an in-house producer, writer, arranger. I had to go out and promote the Life on Mars album. So we'd be on shows with Phyllis Hyman and other artists out there, and I got to work with her and got a hit on her, and with the Jones Girls, the same thing, you know. And they were some of my favorite artists, the Jones Girls. I had kind of experimented with them. Yeah, that's TSOP, and that drum sound, that's Earl Young. That disco, that's Earl Young. That was his sound, and everybody jumped on it. Jean Carn and I became lifelong friends, and when she joined Philly International, she actually toured with my group, and we would do our shows together. Yeah, they burned albums. It was because it's very simple. It's very simple. Don't forget what we were talking about earlier, equality. It brought people together in a way that the powers that be did not want to see. When you went into a disco club, everybody was there. dancing with each other, loving each other, liking each other, getting to know each other, and for the powers that be, in too many cases, leaving with each other, getting married, and creating a diverse community, and they didn't want that. So of course they went against it. Right, and one of the New York DJs actually took a hard hit for that. I can't remember his name. No,
Alan Freed,
no, it was the other guy. His name would come to me. But yeah, payola, yeah, and but I was never in a position to really see that or be a part of that, you know. But unfortunately, yeah, it happened because the radio stations began to say, well, listen, you know, y'all are making all this money. What about us? You know, the DJs, I mean, yeah. I think music changes everyone. I think it helps us to think differently, and in a lot of cases it guides us. I mean, some lyrics from music, it stays in our heads all of our lives, you know. I mean, the importance of the national anthem speaks volumes to what I'm saying there, and why people fight for it and fight against it, you know. Because it speaks to aspects of our lives that in most cases for a lot of people is good, but for a lot of people isn't so good, you know. I think that lyrics in music are important because it's how a lot of us fell in love. You know, the mood of the music, the tonality of it, and what the words were saying made us reach out to each other. So yeah, I think it's extremely important, and to this day, and continues to be. You know, it's something that we can share, even if we're totally different. If we're sitting down listening to Beethoven or Motown, and we can come together. That was a tough for him. You know, he always felt that maybe it shouldn't have been the second single because it sort of like spoke in a way that a lot of people that were supporting him in venues and buying his records didn't like. Oh yeah, I arranged it. I arranged Clean Up the Ghetto, yeah. That was speaking to urban plight, end of story. I mean, and urban plight still exists to this day. You brought up redlining, you know? Yes, I was aware of it when he started it, and then when he became a member of the Nation of Islam. And I supported him then, and I support it now. It is freedom of choice. If you don't have freedom of choice, which unfortunately some people don't want to see around the world, it becomes unfortunate, and it becomes a way of separatism, anger, and violence, you know, when you're not allowed freedom of choice. Yeah, he had his accident less than 1.5 miles from where I lived. So of course, when someone called me to tell me that he had had an accident down there, I got my car and ran down there, and the EMI stuff was out there, and police, and his car was crashed into a medium like that in front of it. But he was gone. They had taken him by the time I got down there. And I went to the hospital to see him, but he was under when they rolled him out of the emergency room and took him out. They took him somewhere else. And eventually I got to see him after that. And he had signed a deal where he had to do a vocal for a movie called Daryl or something like that. And but he couldn't breathe, he couldn't speak. So I would go to his house every day and teach him breathing techniques and solfeggio, which helped him start to speak and to breathe again. And I did that for about a few months until it was time for him to go and do the vocal for the movie. And I was actually going to help him run his Teddy Bear Productions. but his partner decided that she wanted to do something else. Well, I wouldn't say it became cold. I would say that things changed in a way that I think that people were looking at other opportunities and other aspects of the music business, and I think the relationship with CBS really kind of changed things in a way that for the distribution of the product, it became very difficult. Like I think when we had that, we had a couple of other distributors come on board, but it didn't work out. It was like they weren't reaching the same areas or getting the same impact as, you know, as CBS did. So I really think that it was the when CBS decided to no longer distribute Philly International Records, that's when things changed. Yeah, I think so. Fortunately, I think the music speaks for itself and has its own identity, and it's a powerful one. I mean, obviously, Motown's identity, I mean, speaks volumes to what I'm talking about. It gets played everywhere in the world, and so does Philly's music, you know. I think that it helps people, once again, unite and enjoy something in common, turn the radio up, you know, and do things that are good and positive based on what they feel about the music. So, yeah, I think so. I think that there's going to be cultural aspects, not to just American music, but to German music, to African music, to British music, that is going to play a part in the world's vision of each other. So, as far as I'm concerned, hip-hop is a need because it explains a lot of problems that we face here, you know what I'm saying, and in other countries. And it also points to needs that we have here for young people and as well as other countries. You know, young people here, they listen to rappers who maybe aren't speaking a positive message because that's how they feel. You know, they don't feel that they have access. They don't feel they have equality. They're still living in tenants and rents, and it's a tough life for them. So they look for answers through listening to their cell phones or you know, CD players. And that happens all over the world, you know. You can see it in India, you know. You can see it in Africa. You can see it here in the U.S. and in Western Europe. That everyone, whether it's a different issue, we all have issues in this world, and music helps us face it one way or the other. Yeah, I think there are some musicians that have done that. I mean, and people who have followed in the steps. I think Rough House, the record label where the miseducation of I can't remember her name now. From the Fugees.
I know.
What's her name?
I think Dave Hollings made the original, huh, from Fugees.
What's her name? It'll come to me. Edit this. You're going to edit this, right?
No, it didn't. I think it's only used.
The miseducation of.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, Rough House. Jill Scott. She's done quite well for herself too, and she became a actress, and she's in a lot of shows. She had her own show on HBO, there's a lot of good musicians here, and young musicians and young artists that are trying to make music and get music out there. Some of them who are following in the steps of Philly International. I have a son, and his name is Pop Wansel. And Pop Wansel he now has a relationship with Interscope. He's going to have his own label. And he really talks to me about what we did at Philly International. He's had, in the past 7 years, he's had 8 #1 records and about 20 top 10 records. He helped discover Alicia Cara. He started out with Nicki Minaj, Wiz Khalifa, Trey Songz, Usher. He's had hit records on all of them. So from my perspective, yes, there is a legacy from Philly International Records. He used to go down, his school was 7 blocks from Philly International Records building, and he used to come to the building after school, so people like Billy Paul are Uncle Billy. Lou Rawls is Uncle Lou, you know, Aunt Phyllis, you know, Aunt Jean, you know. So yeah, and he made his first music there in the office at PIR, yeah.